comparative literature, and these days even post-colonial studies. I was born in Taiwan, but raised in Libya, educated in Libya and in the United States, right, in America, and now I teach in London. So my personal history is interesting, and that's is part of, right, why I'm doing what I'm doing. And sometimes I feel that when I think about what I want to do, right, with literature, I think it is an attempt to go home, to get home somehow. So let me start by telling you a little bit, an anecdote. I think you might need to, so you might want to edit this a little bit later, an anecdote about myself. When I joined the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies in Tripoli, at the time, University of Al-Fatah, one of my professors, who was Palestinian, asked me, right, first day of class, I was probably not even 19, I was 18. And he said, right, do you know Chinese? And I said, yes, right. And I was going to study literature and do comparative literature. And he said, can you read Chinese? I said, yes. Can you write Chinese? Yes. And he said, you're going to be the ambassador, cultural ambassador between Arabic and Chinese. And I took that to heart. So since I was 18, I have been trying to do Arabic and Chinese comparative literature, right? Bring Arabic literature and Chinese literature together. In Libya, it was not possible because nobody taught Chinese literature. And in China or in Taiwan, I'm from Taiwan, right? If I had wanted to do Arabic and Chinese comparative literature, I didn't think coming back to Taiwan would give me the opportunity to do it, because very few people studied Arabic, and Arabic was probably taught at a very rudimentary level. So I thought, I'm going to the US, right? The first world, the superpower of the first world. And since I was lucky enough to be accepted by Columbia University, I went there to study Arabic and Chinese. And during the first years, like in the US, the system is very different. You take 3 years of courses, you do your orals, your exams, comprehensives, and then you start writing your dissertation or thesis. So I did Arabic literature, and Arabic literature was not difficult for me because I had a very strong background in Arabic literature. So I picked up a lot of courses in Chinese. But when I came to writing the thesis, right, I had two advisors, someone in Chinese department, and of course, Pierre Kakia. And we'll talk about Pierre Kakia in a little bit when we talk about the piece on Orientalism. They both said, yes, if you want to do it, you can, but we don't really know how you can do it because we don't see interactions between Chinese literature and Arabic literature. Yeah.
Can I ask why is that? Why did they feel that there is no interaction?
Because at the time, comparative literature was about sort of like cultural encounters, right? The encounters between two literatures. So at the time when it was done, it was mainly about influence, right? So people who did comparative literature studied Arabic literature and the influences of European literatures on Arabic literature. Those who studied Chinese literature within the comparative literature, like studied European influences on Chinese literature. And it was very rare that you would find, right, people say Arabic, right, influence European or Chinese influence European. I mean, later on, we had this Orientalism, study of Orientalia in Europe, but that's again, influence, right? And so, and sort of like at the time, comparative studies were primarily about the modern period, right? When you can see, right, the presence of Europe through imperialism and colonialism, of course, right, in, right, Arabic and Chinese literatures, right? So, and sort of like, sort of my Chinese professor at the time said, but also the more practical question is going to be, who is going to supervise your dissertation or your thesis, because none of us would have the other, right? And two of them, since as a Chinese professor, I don't know Arabic, right? I can look at Chinese, and your Arabic professor can look at Arabic. But when you bring these two together, who is going to tell whether you're on or off, right? So I have been thinking about these issues since then, but I realize, right, if even if we want to think of culture encounter or intercultural dialogue as the most important thing behind, let's say, comparative literature, right? It is not necessarily that there's no traffic between two cultures or two literary spheres, but it is more about how we do comparative literature that stands in the way of bringing these two together. So take, for example, I just talk about how we conceptualize language, right? If we think of it as pure, right, Arabic, because it's grammatical, right, then it is sovereign like a nation state. Nothing from outside can come in, right? But whereas if we think of it as open, fluid, right, and it absorbs other languages and it is inherently multilingual, right? But when things from outside come in because of grammaticality, right, language absorbs everything and transforms everything into something that is Arabic, right? And the idea of grammaticality comes from the work of a friend, Carla Maletti, who is teaching at Ann Arbor in Michigan, right? So she's talked about grammaticality, and also the Arabic language scholars have talked about the ways in which, right, the Arabic language absorbs, quote unquote, foreignness into its fabric, right, without giving away, right, that it has foreign sources. I mean, you have in the Quran, foreign words and so on and so forth, but they're really limited, right?
Yeah.
But in due course, in time, if I'm not the one who's witnessed this travel of something foreign into my language, 20 years later, 30 years later, nobody would have known. So let's say you're an Arab, right, from the 21st century. It would never occur to you that a democratia, for example, democratia is obvious, right?
Yeah.
Certain words come from outside sources, right, from another language, another culture, because it disappears into your language. So if we begin to imagine language differently, right, as inherently multilingual, but also it's not just word and grammar, but also sound, right, also image, right, and if you think of the visualizing capacity of language, right, then the images that it captures comes from elsewhere. And a good example is objects, right? Objects in literary text, right? So if you see coffee, right, in your text, it is after the 16th century, right? You can even name it. And if you see coffee in a Taiwanese text, right away, aha, right? Where does coffee come from, right? And when did it come into Taiwan? So you're beginning to see the presence of the world, let's call it the world, in your very local context, right? So you have these things, and the other one is embodiment, right? The body language itself, right? So if you begin to think of language differently, right, then you can see how the world comes together in one language that you call Arabic or Chinese. So this is one way of thinking about it, right? And the other sort of like major conceptual category that stands in our way is how we conceptualize the nation state as our community, right? And we imagine it as sovereign with borders, right? And forgetting that the nation state was created very recently in the 19th century, for example, and it becomes this edifice, this structure that define however we think about the world, right? So we think about the world as made up of nation state, of sovereign borders, right? And you can't cross these borders, right? And in order for you to be global or international, you have to travel from out of your nation state. And nation states are often imagined as monolingual, right? Egypt is Arab country, right? So its official language is Arabic, and its literally production is in Arabic. So for an Egyptian work of literature to travel outside of Egypt, it has to go through the means of translation, right? From Arabic into French, so the work can travel to Paris, or into English, so it can travel to London or New York, right? And this is the paradigm, right, that informs how we do word literature. So word literature is defined as national literature that travels to the international arena, which is really Western Europe and North America, through translation, right? From a third world language into French or English, right? So these are sort of like the conceptual blocks, right? That makes us always think of travel in this particular way, right? As something that has to be sanctioned by something else. Right? So these are the conceptual problems that give us trouble when we try to move beyond the kind of comparative literature or word literature that people have been doing, right? So how do you move beyond that, right?
So, can I sort of interject and ask, how much of that do you think is purely down to sort of a colonial view of language and a colonial view of literature in general?
I wouldn't say colonial per se, so it's not per se, but it is definitely derived from Western European epistemology in the 19th century, right? We can think of the mapping, the colonial mapping of the Middle East, right? That the Middle East is mapped into its current nation states, right? That's definitely colonialism, part of colonial legacy, right? But how we think about it is responsive. If we think of it that way, as responsive to this mapping, then yes, it is colonial legacy, right? But in a way, we have a past that allows us to move beyond this colonial legacy, if that makes sense to you, right? Because the Middle East was operated very differently, and the relations between, let's say, the Middle East, and Middle East itself is a colonial category, right? It's an Orientalist category. The Far East is another Orientalist category, right? If you're Arab, you didn't think of the Middle East as Middle East. We thought of our region as Sham, al-Iraq, right? Masr, but Masr is not today's nation state, al-Maghrib, right? These are broadly the regions that we think of, but also people traveled freely, right? From one city to another, one block geographical, right? Vaguely, not necessarily vaguely, right? Sort of like map regions to another, right? Without needing without checkpoints or needing permissions or needing visas, right? So a Moroccan traveler, and Moroccans have written extensively on travels to the East, right? They just traveled to the East and made it all the way to like Ibn Battuta in the 14th century, 13th, all the way to China, right? Crossing all the Muslim lands and so on and so forth. So, we have the past, right, to allow us to transcend how we conceptualize community, but not just community, because nation states becomes a conceptual category that you lock everything into it, right? So Egyptian, what is Egyptian? It's Egyptian, right? Yes, in the Arab world say, Arab as well. But, if you listen to Egyptians, a lot of them will say, no, we're not Arabs, we're Egyptians.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
right. So it's that nation state that becomes the framework of how you think of yourself spatially and temporally, right? Temporally, yeah.
I guess that also it takes form in literature. I guess you can see that evolution of the identity of being somebody who identifies as being sort of belonging to a particular nation at some point.
Yes, yeah, and this is what's happening, right? So, in a sense, instead of in a sense of saying, okay, Moroccan writing, right? How do you study Moroccan writing, right? And what's the history of and we're thinking about Morocco as a nation state, right? So, what you do is you focus of the literary products that are produced within the borders of the nation state, right? But if you use the example of how the Arab authors travel around the Arab countries and travels in Europe and so on and so forth, right? There's so much dialogue going on, right? Between, let's say, Moroccan writers, Tunisian writers, Algerian writers, Libyan writers, Egyptian, all the Arab writers from all around the Arab countries or Arab nation states, but also around the world. Adonis has traveled to China, for example. He's been having dialogues with the Chinese, right? His works have been translated in Chinese. And of course, he speaks French, right? And he travels to French. He traveled everywhere. So there's part of it, right? His writing cannot be contained, right, by, let's say, him as a Syrian, right, a Syrian nation state. This is what I'm talking about. So when you study literature within the national paradigm, what you lose sight of is its connections to the rest of the world, its dialogues with the rest of the world.
What's really interesting to me is there's a couple of things I want to ask, but since we're on this topic, let's continue with this idea. In particular, I want to ask about sort of how influential was the work of Orientalism, and so you get into the work that you guys have done, the case study on Orientalism. But how influential was Orientalism as a piece of work on shedding light on how sort of the dichotomy between like the Oriental world and the Western world?
So I went to Columbia University in 1982, right? And Orientalism was published in 1978, right? And Edward Said was a professor of English literature there. But when I arrived, he was the chair of the comparative literature program, a committee. So I had my first meeting with the professor was with him, right?
Oh, wow.
Comparative literature.
Oh,
right?
wow.
But eventually sort of I abandoned him. And years later when we met, I had a colleague who said, oh, Professor Said, I studied with you. And I was like, I sheepishly said, Professor Said, I didn't take any courses with you. And he looked at me, he said, I know. So it was very influential because as a naive, let's say, student coming from Libya, right, it opened my eyes to the ways in which a literary text is grounded in a complex relationship with its, let's call it, its lived experience, right? In a sense, it's worldliness. It's part of a bigger world. It doesn't just create this romantic, beautiful world out of the ugliness, right? Shedding the ugliness of the world, but everything comes into it. But more importantly, it is informed by not just the text power relationships with other texts, but also the author's power relations with around it. And probably the best person who put it very well is Pierre Bourdieu, sociologist of literature. He says it's sort of like there's a field of cultural production, right, as a field. So literary production would be part of this field of cultural production, but this one is surrounded by a power field, right?
Mm-hmm.
The power field includes political authority, financial powers, social powers, symbolic powers, and so on and so forth, right? And the field of cultural production is by definition, by necessity, subordinate to this power field, but it doesn't mean that individuals, authors, or artists, or producers of culture have no power whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
They can position themselves in such a way so as to open up this power field and allows them to be creative, original, and to also respond to the power field, right? So he talks about agency. And I think what's missing in Edward Said's Orientalism is this space for agency, right? So Orientalism comes as much more total, right? It's a body of knowledge produced by the Orient in the West through the disciplines in the West, right? And for the consumption of the West, right? And it becomes a discourse about the Orient, right? Right? Mm-hmm. And more importantly, Said says, right? And this is also informed by the West will to dominate the Orient, mm-hmm. right? And it's been how many years? I can't remember. I can't count. I'm not very good. It's been at least 40 years, no? 40 years since it was first published. And there has been a lot more research on Orientalism, right? About this category of knowledge produced in the West and through the disciplines of the West, right? And what we're beginning, to see is really, to think of word literature in a good way is really the circulation of people and knowledge, right, across languages and cultures, and in this case, even religions, right? So that what you get is Orientalism as an international collaboration on producing knowledge about Islam and the East and the Orient. So that there's and also what the recent research sort of opens up is this possibility of the Orientalist to take different positions, right? So not all Orientalists are part of the machinery of empire. And I think Edward Said sort of like acknowledged that in his later book, Culture and Imperialism. Yeah. And he says, if we think of culture as a site, right, of opposition and resistance, right, what's happening, right, in probably 1990s was the collaboration among what he called metropolitan intellectuals. And these included, right, Americans, Europeans, but also, and in his particular case study would be the Arab intellectuals, right, who have the mastery of European languages, but European epistemologies, right? And so that they can contribute, right, to fashioning knowledge about the East in a different way, but also resist, right, what he would call hegemony of European epistemology in a much more effective way.
Mm-hmm. Right. So now that you've sort of have been working on comparative literature in between these different worlds for quite some time, we discussed earlier before we started recording the podcast a bit about how now your comparison is between sort of Chinese literature and Arabic literature. So tell me a bit more about that, and where what are the sort of relationships between the two?
Okay, I haven't got quite there yet, but I'm getting there, right? So once we reimagine language differently and we imagine the ways we can do comparative literature and word literature differently, right, we can begin to use things that we find in literary text to open out the text into intercultural dialogue. And the intercultural dialogue does not necessarily have to be symmetrical, right? In terms of time, or in terms of geography, or in terms of language, or it doesn't have to be symmetrical. So recently I have been developing the idea of the Silk Roads of word literature, right?
Okay.
The Silk Roads, and I think it was so what and I probably let it slip about coffee and tea. So what I'm trying to think is, if we can everything is multilingual in my brain right now, right? So using the model of word literature, but instead of focusing on text, literary works themselves, traveling through translation, what if we shift our sight to things, right? Ideas, things, people, ideas, ideology, and worldviews and languages that travel, right? And you can actually trace these in our literary text. So let's say things, right? Silk is one, right? So silk comes from China. So I have to pick two things, right? Things, one from China, one from Arabic. And they don't have to be symmetrical. So silk is interesting, right? For Huda Barakat, for example, Harith al-Miyah, the tiller of waters, right? Silk is the fabric of her prose, right? But also silk, she through her text, as she writes the history in her novel of cosmopolitan Beirut, right? Beirut, the cosmopolitan history of Beirut. She uses silk, right, to give you the history of silk and Beirut's relationship with import of silk and silk industry, right? Silk paraphernalia, right? In order to give you this texture of the city, the cosmopolitanness of Beirut city, right? So silk is interesting. So you can see, what's going on, right? So silk is not just a thing; it's the fabric of narrative, right?
Yeah.
Silk is interesting because everywhere it went, right, it also generated local farming and local industries and local cultures. Right. So in Syria, in the sort of 19th century, silk was very important part of economy, right, in the Levant, right? And that collapsed towards the second half of the 19th century, right? And the silk farming and silk export and silk industry supported the rise of a new kind of Arabic writing, right? And you find this in Elizabeth Holt's book, right? Silk Capital. And with the collapse of the silk, because of French competition, right? Also, the new, right, intellectual writerly class moved to Cairo, and in Cairo you have the cotton farming and cotton trade and cotton industry, right? So it's interesting that way, right? So silk is one, and the other one that I have looked at is jade, right? Jade is prized and valued in China, right? But itself comes from Central Asia.
Okay.
So you think, oh, why, what, so in one of the Chinese women's novels, it's called, and she comes from a Muslim background, it's called The Muslim Funeral, right? Jade is the thing, jade art, jade carving, jade history, right, is the thing that brings the threads of narrative together in this novel, right? And this novel is about the history of Muslims in China.
Oh, that's really
amazing. It's amazing, isn't it? Right?
That's amazing.
Yeah. So it is about it. So thing is not just a thing. Thing is entire culture. Is the fabric of your writing. And once you move to coffee, it's even more interesting because it's much more pervasive.
Yeah.
Right? So coffee comes from East Africa. It traveled around the world through Yemen, right, Mocha, and then from Yemen to Mecca to Istanbul, and then right away to Europe, right? But
Oh,
coffee,
that's the root
yeah,
of the book.
coffee is not just a bean or husk. It's not just a drink, right? It's an entire cultural institution, and it brings with it coffee house.
Mm.
And if you look at the coffee house in Naguib Mahfouz, right,
Mm-hmm.
it is the sort of home. It is the place. It is the public sphere where the nation is born.
Mm.
Right.
That's really
And as you travel, you travel with coffee. Coffee means something in Arabic writing. Coffee means another thing in European writing, and coffee means different things in Japanese writing and in Taiwanese writing. So you can establish how coffee, right, itself link the world, and colonialism is a huge part of it, of course, but also how you diversify and produce different cultures, cultural expressions, and cultural sort of institutions and rights of consumption. Right, that's
Mhm.
important. It's not just about roasting your coffee beans. Taiwanese not pride themselves; they're the best, roasters of coffee
Mhm.
beans, and so on and so forth. Right, and then you bring tea. Right, so coffee from the Middle East, tea from China, and then you realize that wait a second, right? Tea does pretty much the same thing, but tea in Japanese writing is also like silk in Huda Baraka's text, the very fabric of language and literary text, right? And Japanese tea houses and tea ceremonies are world famous. Right? We Chinese who produce tea, we don't even do that, right?
Mm.
But the Chinese intellectuals, right, like Mahfouz and his cohorts, right, met in tea houses, talked about their work in tea houses, and spent their time writing in tea houses, right? And the tea houses travel from China through Central Asia all the way to like Azerbaijan, right? So in
Mm.
Central Asia, you have the chai khane. And when I was in Kazakhstan, someone actually told me, well, actually, the coffee house was modeled on the tea house.
Wow. Okay. So
All right.
it was sort of a development that came after.
Yeah, so but it's interesting that tea. So coffee started earlier in the Middle East, and tea came in later, right? But in sort of like in Central Asia, you have the tea houses. So I don't know because
Mm.
Turkey is one of the earliest places for that had tea houses, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know. I'm still finding out about this research, whether there's true. But you can see tea houses are the same as coffee houses. Tea house. Um, Tea was introduced in England through the coffee house,
Mhm.
right, in England, but it functions differently elsewhere. But a coffee house is not in Europe. It's not just a coffee house. It's also a place where you can go and sit, right, and have dessert and have food. In the Middle East is the same. And if you read Orhan Pamuk's novel My Name is Red, um, coffee house is where men sit knee to knee doing God knows what,
Yeah.
right? So there was an attempt at banning coffee houses, right, in Mecca and in Istanbul.
That's
And
right.
in Naguib Mahfouz's coffee house, man, too many things go on, right? You
Mm.
can sell your body parts in the coffee house, right? You drink alcohol, you smoke drugs, right? In coffee houses. So it's so that's what so that these are the things, right? So once you begin to think about it, but coffee is so much part of our language, right? Again, tea and coffee is so much part of our language that we don't think of it as foreign, whether you think of it in English or
Yeah,
in
that's right.
Arabic
That's right.
or Chinese,
Mm.
right? It's not foreign, right? The most interesting thing I found was an entire anthology of poems on atay, which is tea in Moroccan,
Mm.
in Morocco. So there's a
Wow.
collection of poetry all about tea.
That's really interesting, and I mean, it's become. I mean, the Moroccans have sort of have their own now.
Yes.
Identify with tea in a particular way.
Yeah.
So
Totally.
that's the same concept of sort of something coming in from another country, but then through the use of language or culture, sort of merges into society, but merges into everyday life.
Yeah, and this is what I did when I did the case study on Orientalism in Taha Hussein's Orientalism, right? And basically Taha Hussein, right, picked up, right, certain ideas from, let's say, European Orientalism. I can think of two in particular. One is the idea that pre-Islamic Arabic poetry was not authentic, right? It was fabricated later, right? So this was one Orientalism. And the other one is, so this was, he used that, right, to say, can we trust, and this has something to do with Arabic studies itself, right? If we want to understand the language of the Quran, where do we go? Where do we turn to? We turn to pre-Islamic Arabic poetry because that's Diwan al-Arab, that's the repository of the Arabic language, Arabic poetry, Arabic culture, right? And sort of like Taha Hussein comes and he says, but we can authenticate that, right? So can we really trust that as a historical document or a document that gives us how Arabs used Arabic at the time the Quran was revealed, for example? So that he took this idea, right? And the other one is actually interesting because it's a more positive one, which is knowledge of ancient civilizations in Egypt and in Iraq and in Syria, right? Palestine, Syria, right? And he would use these, and these were all European discoveries, right? In Arabic books, you find mentions of these, but it was the Europeans who deciphered these ancient languages and published the text and translated them into modern languages, right? So he sort of, Taha Hussein then used this new knowledge about ancient Egypt to say, but Egyptian identity is rooted in ancient pharaonic Egypt, not in sort of Arabic Islamic Egypt only. So in a way, right? So this Orientalism, if you take it, right? It's a body of knowledge that travels, right? But when it travels, it picks up different functions, right?
Yes.
Right. And its function is not determined by how the West saw the function of Orientalism, but by how local or native intellectuals saw its proper place, or its place, not necessarily proper, in the larger scheme of how they were imagining their community. So Taha Hussein comes in and says, right, so we have all this information now. I can tell you, like, Egyptian identity is multiple, right? It's Egyptian, it's Arabic, Islamic, but it's also pharaonic. And more importantly, because of the Greek and relationship with the Greek, it is Mediterranean. So basically, right, if we are going to continue to be rooted in this, I call it cosmopolitan identity, then we need all the languages of these regions in the past and at present, right? So we need to learn Latin, we need to learn Greek, we need to learn Arabic, we need to learn French, we need to learn English, right? And pretty soon, he's going to say we need to learn Pharaonic as well. And I think he probably said it would be best if we could, right? So it is about that, right? And he would say we're not just one thing, right? All these things, and this is what we want, right? And this is the future, مستقبل الثقافة في مصر, right? The future of our culture in Egypt, right? So this is so what I wanted to be able to do, right, with this case studies is, again, to show the dialogues that take place, right, even around something like Orientalism, right? And the ways in which, right, agency of intellectuals who even borrow the concept and borrow the paradigms or structures, right, use this, right, in order to fashion their own worldview, right? So it's part and parcel of all that. And the other thing I wanted to be able to do is really, and this is methodological and theoretical, is to restore the complexity of the context in which Taha Hussein was speaking, right? He was not just, he was responding not just to Europe, and he was not blindly imitating Europe, right? He was responding, right? And he was responding to the type of writing he was doing, right? He was not just writing an academic book, right? He was writing for the general public. He was writing for his colleagues, right? Right? He was responding to them, and they all came from different positions, right? And I wanted that, right, as part of a larger project of seeing Egyptian culture at the time, right? So it's the context of, and I think I talk about print culture, right? Its audience, right? And how complex, how nuanced, how rich it was, right? And I wanted to restore Taha Hussein to that complex, huge fabric, right? And the other thing I wanted to be able to do was also restore Orientalism to its original context, right? As part of Europe's discourse about itself, right?
Okay.
So Orientalism was part of European discourse about its own modernism and modernity, and Europeanism is always twined or twinned with something called medievalism, right? So these were othered, right? And European modernism would go back to the classical heritage and say, classics, right? Our classical heritage is the root of our modernism, of our modernity, right? So in a sense, I wanted that to be much clearer, right?
Yeah.
It's not just targeted against the Middle East to say, you're the other, you're the enemy, or whatever. It's not just part of that. It's part of larger vision of modern Europe. If that makes sense to you.
I mean, that's fascinating in that just sort of this concept of Orientalism can take so many different forms wherever you take it, within regions and within sort of the like bigger sort of divisions.
Yeah, but it's very important for me to be able to say that I don't want that to deny that, you know, part of Orientalism, that some of it was also part of the colonial machinery, right? I don't want to say, I think that remains a part of it, right?
Yeah,
whatever Said identified remained a part of it, but not all Orientalism was that.
Most definitely.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on.